BA. The first presenter we have this morning is Professor Donald B. Smith. He's from the University of Calgary and a member of the Order of the University of Calgary, awarded in 2013. He taught Canadian history at the University of Calgary from 1974 to 2009. He was born in Toronto and raised in Oakville, Ontario. He obtained his Honours BA in Modern History from the University of Toronto in 1968. His MA from the University of Laval, Quebec in 1969, and his PhD from the University of Toronto in 1975. Donald is going to come forward and talk about New Credit and Canada in the first 50 years. Please join me in welcoming Donald.
Thank you very much. And it's unbelievable how the gathering has grown. I've been here, I'm pretty sure, all of them, all 7, and it's fantastic. And this year you've gone way beyond expectations, and thanks for having me. Now, what I'm going to do today is really a quick summary of a half century of New Credit after Confederation. Now, for myself, I'll tell you right at the outset, in history, Canadian history, my favorite time period is the 50s, the 1850s. I'm a really modern guy. You should see my conversations here with David about the technology. No, but so I'm leaving my treasured precious land, the 1850s, and of course the credit is very close to my heart in my beloved time period. So I'm going to be very adventurous and move into the 1860s. And I'm going to be really, really adventurous. We're going up to World War I. Okay, it's be a journey. Going to do it the same way we did yesterday. A little bit of a summary at the start, and then a visual presentation, and I'll be able to catch up with the points that I miss in the oral beginning in the visual presentation, because I have some slides and I'll think of additional parts to explain just what's going on. And as yesterday, I really truly encourage people out there to take up the baton, young people. If there's anyone with a knowledge, who is interested in the history, with a knowledge, a cultural background, and of course linguistic would be a terrific asset, go for it. As I said yesterday, all my research notes for my 2 books are at Victoria College, University of Toronto, in their archives, and also at Trent University Archives. They're in total 40 research boxes of notes. They've been very well taken care of. The inventory is on the web, and I've passed the baton. So this will be a look back at 50 years, time period, not my specialization, but I can cover it. And we'll look at New Credit from 1860s to World War I, 1910s. Now, just before though, after all these years studying your history, and believe you me, it's been wonderful, absolutely, total support. Half a century of studying the history of the Mississauga. I'd like to just sort of give an observation. I think for the last 200 years, you could divide your history into 3 sections. Or, I mean, to tell the story, you could divide it in 3 sections. The first is the Peter Jones segment, and that's what I did. I spent a great number of years studying Peter Jones and the Mississauga, the old credit mission, the move to New Credit, and then that was it. Peter Jones dies in 1856. That was my specialty. And then I continued on, and I did a couple of individuals from Old Credit Mission, plus some other Mississauga people in a book called Mississauga Portraits. That was the second book. And in the second book, there are 8 portraits. Well, I'd just like to tell you that what I'm doing today is I am taking material from someone else, Alan Sherwin. Alan Sherwin, who had that wonderful tribute from Margaret yesterday, a terrific friend of New Credit, neurologist, faculty of medicine, McGill University, who wrote the biography of Peter Jones' son, Dr. Peter E. Jones. He wrote his book, Bridging Two Peoples. And Alan and I used to joke that this is the 9th portrait. There are 8 Mississauga portraits in Mississauga Portraits, my book. This is the 9th. And boy, is this book good. I knew that before, but when you read it, it bears in, and you're reading really fast to prepare for today. it's a wow. It really is something. Bridging Two Peoples, Alan Sherwin, and it's the story of Dr. Peter Edmund Jones, and this is what I'm basing the talk on. Really, essentially it is. It covers the years, the period I'm doing. Dr. Jones dies in 1909, so it falls a little short, but I can take it after that. So, 3 time periods to New Credit. I mean, I'm talking as a non-Aboriginal storyteller type person. The first period, over the 200-year period, would be Peter Jones and his story. Then secondly, Dr. Peter Edmund Jones, medical doctor, a member, head chief of New Credit, and doctor for New Credit. Big man in the provincial Indian Council and all, great figure, which I'll talk about him today based on Alan Sherwin's book. But then you've got the third period, and this is what I'm waiting for, perhaps at a future gathering. The third period, I would say, you could tell the story through the eyes of a remarkable gentleman I had the pleasure of knowing, whose name has been given to the school. I think the secret's out. Lloyd King. Lloyd, in his lifetime, you can tell the story of New Credit in the 20th century just through the life of Lloyd King. And Lloyd has given us an enormous amount of writings, and of course, community members remember him well. I would do it that way. I'd do Peter Jones first, Dr. Peter Edmund Jones, and then Lloyd King. And Lloyd King, that's a work to be done. I'll introduce Lloyd right at the end, but he's born in 1915, so that's the 20th century. Well, this is all preliminary. We'll now get close to the subject. We're going to look at Dr. Peter E. Jones first, then we'll do a big sketch with the pictures. What is so wonderful about the Mississaugas is, particularly the Mississaugas of New Credit, you have a paper trail. You have this enormous amount of information about you. And there are not many First Nations groups that do. I'm a documentary historian. I respect oral history, but I don't have the language, don't have the culture. I'm a documentary person, and you folks have it. Thanks to, large part, Peter Jones, Dr. Peter Edmund Jones, and Lloyd King. You've got an enormous amount of written records. So that makes the story tellable, particularly for a non-Aboriginal audience. So, thanks to these resources, Lloyd, and a great deal of energy, Alan Sherwin was able to write his book. It tells the story of a remarkable individual who started life with really a challenge. Peter Edmund Jones was Peter and Eliza Jones' third son. And as a young man, he had polio. So this was a real challenge for him. He didn't have the mobility of other young Mississauga children in the community because of polio. But he had the advantage of being with his parents, who loved books, were very scholarly, and he grew up in that tradition. He grew up with the importance of land claims from his father and the importance of documenting them. Now, I will be quite blunt. Kim's coming back. Kim's coming tomorrow. Again, he was here yesterday. But a lot of legal work is done on documents, and that's what Peter Jones created, a lot of those, as well as the council and all. But Dr. Peter E. Jones kept those documents, and they are being very helpful in the land claim business. So Peter Edmund Jones grew up then with this respect for written materials and all, and a great commitment to his people, a great commitment to land claims, to education, and to health. And because he became a medical doctor, graduated from Queen's in 1866, he was able to do something about the medical file, big time. So just an overview, and we'll just then do the big visual extravaganza at the end. Peter Edmund Jones was born 1843, and as I mentioned, he had the polio experience, which was very, very challenging for him. Get this, ready for this? I'll tell you folks, when you're on the time machine, you're going to be surprised. Constantly. I am. Where was his where did he go to school? Residential school. Mount Elgin. but not for long. I just mentioned that because it's such a startling fact, isn't it? Yeah, after Peter Jones's death, his wife, Eliza, sent Peter Edmund Jones to Mount Elgin Residential School because she was felt it was very important for him to be with First Nations people, and also to reinforce his language, because I mean, this is an eye-opener. I don't know what Mount Elgin, I never studied it myself, but the kids must have been speaking Ojibwe, the Chippewa, the Thames folks and all. There must have been some attraction for Eliza to do this, but she did. But it didn't work out because his English was too far advanced. He'd been raised with English at home, and his educational level just wasn't, it didn't work at Mount Elgin. So he came back. He was privately schooled in Brantford, and eventually he has, I think, Brantford High School or something. Anyways, he's schooled in Brantford, and with that background, he applies for medical school, and bright fellow, and gets into Toronto, and then he transfers to Queen's, and that's where he finishes his degree. Important to mention, he did his thesis in med school. At that time, you had to do a thesis, and he did it on Indian medicines. Alan Sherwin did his darndest to find it, but it doesn't survive. But from related information, we know that in this thesis Dr. Peter Edmund Jones was a great believer in herbal medicines. And Alan Sherwin, medical doctor, he really emphasizes that. And he takes the native medicines and compares it with what was available in the 19th century. And the native medicines, make your own judgment of this, but my reading is that the native medicines, the herbal medicines, in many cases were better than what was being offered in the mainline system. So Peter Edmund Jones, he's got an open mind, he's intelligent, and he wants to make a difference. He becomes a medical doctor. He starts his medical practice, actually a little entry into the United States for a while, but then comes back and establishes his practice in Hagersville. In 1873, he marries a widow. He was an English background, his wife, and again, the wonders of the Indian Act, she immediately becomes an Indian on the marriage. Not Eliza, her name's Charlotte Dixon, an English widow, and she was very supportive. They had a good marriage, and anyways, things start to happen. 1874, Chief George King passes away, and he was very popular, very successful, Ojibwe speaker, church interpreter, I think, amongst other roles in the community. And of course, Mississaugas in the 19th century, you were big Methodists. I mean, most families very supportive. Somehow or other, there was a bridging there, and an Indian face was put on the Methodism, now the United Church of Canada. In short, George King was an active participant, as were many members of the community. So, in any case, he passes away. His gravestone, by the way, is in front of the church with Chief Sawyer, Joseph Sawyer, and Reverend Herkimer, and Mississauga the Credit, who also became an ordained minister. So anyways, George King passed away, and the elected chief system had just been introduced. Peter Edmund Jones was elected chief in 1874. So now here he has these ambitions. He wants to follow his father. His father died in 1856. He wants to improve the community and do what he can, particularly in the health file, but also on self-government, also on economic self-sufficiency. He's got a lot to do, and as head chief, he does it. In terms of medicine, this is a remarkable story. Anyone doing the history of medicine in Canada, personally, wow, what results. Look at Malcolm King. Dr. Malcolm King, what he's done in the field of medicine on a national level. Well, a century plus before him, there was Dr. Jones out there here in the community. He introduced quarantine for infectious diseases. The quarantine really helped. He took public health, introduced public health methods into the community. And thanks to his energetic medical intervention, the death rate declined. And New Credit's population went from 200 to 242 in the years that he was active as chief. And later he was chief and doctor in the early days. He was the medical doctor as well as the chief. So he introduced this very energetic health response and really helped the community get larger. But he couldn't do anything about TB. TB is absolutely, well, to World War II and antibiotics, it's just a killer. It's absolutely lethal. And new credits continue to suffer from tuberculosis, but not to with the other diseases and all. There was a great improvement made, and the population increased. So, Dr. Jones has made his mark in terms of medical practices. In terms of politics, he also was very important. He became Secretary-Treasurer of the Grand Indian Council of Ontario and Quebec. So he's the secretary, he's the coordinator. So he's important provincially. This man now, he's in his late 30s. It's in his administration that we have a lasting memento of this era. And if you want to see it, it's the Council House. The Council House, which is standing, and New Credits cherishes it. It was built, the old Council House, my apologies. And the old Council House was built 1882. And that, in a way, is sort of a visual memory of Dr. Jones. Big do, 3,000 people came. It was tremendous, one of New Credits' finest moments. Included in the group were Six Nations person John Smoke Johnson, Pauline Johnson's grandfather, who'd been in the War of 1812. And this is 1882, 70 years after the War of 1812. And John Smoke Johnson was here and gave good wishes from the Six Nations. Incidentally, Dr. Jones was very respectful towards the Longhouse people at Six Nations. And in an article in 1879 in the Haldeman Atlas, that's Alan, he's applying his rigorous medical skills to research, and he finds it, if it's there. 1879, I just read this morning, thought it was very significant. He had a high esteem for the Longhouse people and described them in this article as having higher morality and sobriety than the Christians. Well, okay, that must have cost him something when he went to Hagersville the next visit. But that's it. You got an independent thinker. And he wants to go farther on this. Okay, another surprise. He is not derogatory, or he doesn't dismiss residential schools. And I know that sort of sounds pretty heavy duty, doesn't it? Well, it's got to be remembered that the real impact of those schools, the real sort of steel of it, came later. So he's looking at a pretty soft touch. Well, no, I'm not pretending to know a great deal about this file. But of course, I just wanted to mention he didn't make a big tirade about it. Well, he really didn't have to. New Credit had 2 schools. The kids didn't have to. And they had their own native teachers. See, you folks, you're just head of the wave. You're right. Well, it wasn't a big deal, in short, for this community, because you had your teachers in the schools, and you had 2 schools, and so good. That's just sort of a little detail I wanted to add. Now, those of you, I subscribed for many years. I must have been one of the few Calgary subscribers to TECA. TECA, remembered and beloved, I hope. The Six Nations and New Credit newspaper, it folded about 15 years ago. I believe Lloyd King was part of one of the founders of that newspaper. Well, TECA, which started in the late 60s, early 70s, anyways, and lasted for 30 years or so, TECA had a predecessor, and that was the newspaper that Dr. Jones created. And he created the paper called The Indian in 1886. This is the first Aboriginal newspaper in Canada. Again, New Credit first. First newspaper. Gosh. And that's where I learned about his ideas about residential schools, or Alan did. And you find out a lot about what he thought. So much that's why he's good. He's good to tell a story of New Credit in the late 19th century, because you've got a lot of documents to work with. This newspaper being a good one. Okay. Now, this sounds pretty impressive, doesn't it? He's leading his community forward, but in any healthy community, it's just not one side, right? Oh, I hope not. I don't want to live in a place where everybody thinks the same. Well, there was another opinion about Dr. Jones, and that was he was too accommodating. He was just too obliging to the powers that be. And the opponent is We're really close, folks. Don't get restless. We're close to the visuals. Very close. And I'll show you a picture. I don't have a picture of the gentleman, but I have a picture of his dad. And Peter Jones's nemesis was a relative. It was a cousin. I can't say that's and you don't even do cousins. I mean, like, that's English kind of stuff. The second cousin, third cousin, all that. That's not in the books in your language. But in short, but I'm a non-Aboriginal, so he's a cousin. Okay, like I think he's second cousin. This gentleman's name is George Henry, and George Henry is a son of Mongwudas. Mongwudas was Peter Jones' nemesis. Because what Peter Jones wanted to do, usually Mongwudas wanted to do something different. It's like it's just delightful reading Mongwudas, and that's a chapter in my book. But now it's second generational. It's Dr. Jones versus George Henry, Mongwudas' son, and Mongwudas' son, George Henry, thinks, Dr. Peter Jones, you are going too far. We are Anishinaabe. We are First Nations people. Why are you being so friggin' accommodating? You're cooperating with John A. Macdonald, advising him on the Indian Act. You see, Dr. Jones, he's in the system. He's been to Queens. He's very familiar with the larger world. And he's trying to soften this Indian Act thing up. And he's advising the Prime Minister. And here's another surprise. John A. Macdonald and Dr. Jones got along quite well. They really did. And Dr. Jones was ecstatic that John A. Macdonald gave the federal vote to First Nations people without obliging them to lose their status. That's what Macdonald did. That's not well known, you know. He's got this pretty bad press out there, but he wanted the franchise. He wanted people, of course, it's the Times, it's males only, sorry. But if you had property, First Nations person, you could vote under Macdonald's electoral bill without losing your status. The Liberals pulled that away 13 years later. But for an initial moment there, that was Macdonald's gift. And Dr. Jones loved that. But George Henry's not so knocked out by that. And he's not so knocked out by Dr. Jones's, he's just so darn accommodating. He wants more of an assertion of First Nations rights. Now, Dr. Jones worked on land claims because he had the documents. And he puts in effect a lot of initiatives. And John A. Macdonald supported some of the financial claims of Macdonald. It's all of Dr. Jones. It's all explained in Alan's book. It's quite complex, and I promise you those visuals, and I keep my word. Within 2 or 3 minutes, we'll be in the visuals. Everyone wants visuals now. Okay, so Dr. Jones fights away, but he's got the Mongwudas' son, George Henry, biting at his heels. And it's not George Henry. He wants more promotion of the language and more insistence on the Anishinaabe face of New Credit. So he continues on though, and all goes well. I can pretty well tie it up here in the sense of Dr. Jones. Oh, big contribution towards the end. He resolves a really big problem for you guys. That is your relationship with Six Nations. Because were you, in the late 19th century, were you owners of this new territory, of the New Credit? Were you owners or occupants? The Six Nations in the late 19th century said you were occupants, not owners. You see, you've been invited. See, first of all, the Mississauga let the Six Nations come, and then the Six Nations let the Mississauga come. And this is quite involved and complex. But in the late 19th century, the issue was Six Nations said they were the proprietors of this land. And you guys said, no, you invited us here. We originally had it. And it's quite complex, but in short, there was a real stalemate on that. And eventually, Dr. Jones sets in place the structure by which it would be resolved. New Credit pays $10,000, and then it's yours. So it's all that claim of Six Nations has disappeared. I just wanted to add that because it's not often brought out. And Alan tells the whole story. So moving along here, the Liberals win in 1896. Macdonald's died. His party kind of falls apart after his death. And in 1896, they're defeated at the polls. The Liberals come in, Wilfrid Laurier. Well, you know, folks, you got to know 19th century politics. Otherwise, you really don't come into this with the right understanding. And some present-day commentators, they sort of think it's like, well, today. Well, it is a bit like today. But it's a little different in that in those days, when the party in power came in, the civil service changed very quickly. Peter Jones had become an Indian agent, one of the First Nations Indian agents, and he was a conservative appointee. As soon as the Liberals come in, out he goes. So Dr. Jones is no longer Indian agent. Mangwadas has been fighting to get him removed as a New Credit doctor, and eventually he loses that one. And Dr. Jones is very quiet last 10 years or so, and unfortunately he dies in 1909 of cancer. And that's it. But what enormous contribution. I'm not saying in any way that you buy into my and Alan's positive impression of him. He was accommodationist, and you might set the whole story up differently. But one thing you have to recognize, that he saved those documents. He saved so many things that makes it a discussion. And history always has to be a discussion. Now, before I go into my sermon, let's go to visuals. Okay, now this is going to be quite rapid fire, folks. I've got about 10 minutes, I guess, 15. Start here, 1867. Again, we've got to do a little bit of time traveling. That's what Canada looked like. Very tiny outfit, 10% of the land area of today. 4 provinces, that's all. And First Nations, very, very much ignored. As the speakers have told us, very, very limited recognition. And this wardship idea, the Gradual Act for Civilization, was firmly in place. It's going to be refined. The Indian Act is a result of that. So First Nations, pretty, 1% of the population. This house also has to be considered. We've got it's 1%. Settlement was so intense and rapid that First Nations have become 1%. And ignored, definitely. But then Canada expands. And suddenly there is a huge First Nations population in the West, to which the policy evolved for Ontario and Quebec will be expanded westward, but the Ontario-Quebec situation was entirely different. The First Nations were 1% of the population. In the West, the majority. How can you apply this policy out west? Well, living in Alberta 43 years, it was a big mess. Oh, there we go. Okay, again, just a little bit of review. This is the iconic slide, the one of the territories of the Mississauga, just at the moment of treaty. And New Credit, of course. Ironic that fishers, people lived off the resources of Lake Ontario, end up inland. But it's all part of the injustices of the experience. We did this, I believe we did it yesterday, and just wanted to, in the 1860s, there's still native speakers. William Elliot, I want to come back to William Elliot, make sure I do. William Elliot was the last person in the community who was a fluent speaker, and Lloyd King knew him. So that's our bridge. But these are the names, and our time doesn't permit to go through them all. But I just wanted to point out that, yes, Toronto is Toronto. It's an Iroquoian word. But you folks have your own word for it. It's Minising. Minising is Toronto, and that it's the island. Yeah, you see, it's island, the island, Toronto Islands today, but your recognition of it was the island, Minising. So that's what you called it. And then the other names are wonderful. Hamilton, a place where a small kind of turtles lay their eggs. That's a gem. And I love St. Catharines area, Eagle's Nest Place. Those are my 2 favorites. But these are all out there, just giving you an idea of the flavor of it. And you look at those names, you see the closeness to the environment from those names. The Credit Mission, that's the old Credit. It's founded in 1826. This is Peter Jones' story. You make a big success of things. You start to farm, and schooling started. Your schools are superior to what the settlers had in that area for at least 2 decades. And you start to farm, and it's a good adjustment. Peter Jones wants you to be, he wants the community to be self-sufficient. He wants to stay there. He wants it to be there forever. But the pressures of settlement are too great. And also disease continues to be a problem. The settler natural increase is twice as great as New Credit, as the Credit Mission. So eventually all these ingredients together is decided to move in 1847 and coming to New Credit. Oh, I'm just thinking now about in the 1860s, because that's when the talk technically on the program starts. There would be people who would remember First Nations members of the community, Mississaugas, who had fought in the War of 1812. It would be very current. And before. That gentleman, that's a Mrs. Simcoe sketch. That's in the 1790s, but it shows that hair Yes, that's a bravado to, if someone wants to try and take this chap on and take a scalp, that's a bravado, just saying, try it. And just going back in the atmosphere, these warriors ethic, the whole warrior story is not what I'm doing today at all, but there would have been a number of members of the community that would know people that had been. Lawrence Herkimer had been in the War of 1812, and he was here. There'd still be the memories of beating the Iroquois, pushing them out of southern Ontario. That's a pictograph on Lake Simcoe, and it shows the Ojibwe version, the Anishinaabe version of what happened during these wars in the late 17th century, around 1700. The Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe, trounced the Iroquois. That's an Iroquois getting it on the head. If there's Six Nations people out there, I know you could spend hours disputing this with me, but that's not going to be, because we don't have the time. And unfortunately, I have to leave around noon. I'm very, very sorry, because it's just very, very sorry. And I have to pass through Six Nations, so can I have some bodyguards? Little students here today? I need some support. So I'll just, wisdom, discretion's the greater part of valor, right? We'll just stop the story of the Iroquois-Ojibwe Wars. So that well remembered. And but this is the reality for the folks in the 1830s and 40s. It's religion, Methodism. That's today's United Church. And there was a simplicity to it. There was as common values that the people took hold. Not all, but large numbers, particularly in the credit. The credit mission was all converts. So that was the motor. It gave it, and it was a moment of crisis for the community. It gave them a transition point. Not by the 1860s and 1870s, not everyone is Methodist anymore. And in fact, Peter Jones becomes an Anglican. Dr. Peter Jones becomes an Anglican because of his wife. So it's losing its bit of its fervor, but there still was an active community. And Mississaugas, I said that I think yesterday in my speech. There were about 200 members, and 24 were church workers in the 1830s, going across throughout the Great Lakes, taking this religious message to other communities. And it's an Indian Christianity, please. It's their idea, the common values where they embrace them. And we have them going then throughout the Ojibwe world, people from Credit Mission, and going to Europe. Peter Jones several times. This is just a map, and this is our story. And the resolution of the land issue was made in 1903. Dr. Peter Jones started that, and there was reconciliation of the two groups. Here's the church, wonderful church. And it is, I believe, a state church in the sense the council has responsibility for the upkeep of the building. And that's wrong, correct me, please. But I think definitely it's a very close, you see that close association with the church. Here's one of your great figures, Joseph Sawyer, sloping sky, and he's buried in front of the church. He was a very, very staunch Mississauga Methodist, Peter Jones's uncle. That's a great portrait. It's in the Toronto Public Library. Another leader, and he's alive at the beginning of this. I'm supposed to be starting and should be restricting myself to that 50 years after, but I can't. I go where my visuals are. This is a great shot. This is another prominent leader in the community. He became an ordained minister as well. His name is William Herkimer, and that's a great shot. And he'd given Peter Jones some grief. He too felt Peter Jones, the dad, was going too far towards the dominant society, just as Mongwadas felt Dr. Peter E. Jones was as well. But you see the strengths of his portrait there, and he's buried in front of the church as well. There's George King, William Herkimer, and Joseph Sawyer, all there. Oh, that's just out of the minutes book. Darren Wabinga has a copy of the church book, and if anyone ever doubts the sincerity, the commitment of a number of Mississauga to the Methodist Church, ask Darren to show you that church book, because there's so many friggin' names, and they're exhorters, or they're doing some church work somewhere or other. This is 1875, and the fire's still there. And these are names of exhorters. There's William Herkimer at the top, and then there's class leaders, exhorters. That's sort of a stir them up kind of role, and stewards. In short, the commitment was very strong. That's George King He was interpreter. Well, he's chief, but also interpreter. I mean, two roles. One worldly, the other spiritual. It's real commitment. Oh, that's Charles Herkimer. And he's up. So is, actually, the portraits are up in the Great Hall there. He was a great singer, actually, very, very popular in the chorus, in the hymns and whatnot. That was very, very important figure in your community, and Herkimer's still members. I believe some Herkimers. There's Peter Jones. So Dr. Peter E. Jones. There he is. His portrait is up as well. So he's the one I made my remarks about. Outstanding individual. First, actually, Alan determined this. Ronateka, Peter Martin of Six Nations, he's sometimes said to be the first MD, First Nations MD in Canada. But actually, Alan found out it was Peter Edmund Jones, who graduated from Queen's with his MD a couple of months before. So there's a new credit first. Okay, Canada's changed, and we get the expansion. 4 provinces become very quickly 9, and it's ocean to ocean. It's actually ocean to ocean to ocean. It's Atlantic to Pacific to the Arctic. So that's Canada, 1882. This is the time Dr. Jones is head chief, medical doctor, and eventually in the late 1880s he's going to be Indian agent as well. Just think, again, I want to just try to be fair here. MacDonald, in trying to put this country together, enormous number of mistakes, and also, but I want in fairness to tell you what his world was. You see, in history, you've always got to, these people are different, the times were different, it's all set up differently. He was on a different train. His idea was, and this is the high point of imperialism, he thinks that this great civilization, the British approach to things is ultimate, is so great, it's the highest point of civilization that can be reached. And he wants to bring the First Nations in on that. And that's why the assimilation is to raise them up, to become citizens. That's the whole thing with MacDonald. He does not recognize the separate nature, that First Nations might want to stay the same, and they definitely do. I'm doing this book on white attitudes, non-Aboriginal attitudes towards First Nations, 1867, 2017. And I call it, my title, tentative title of the book is The Blind Spot, because regardless of their intelligence, political power, or background, or age, non-Aboriginal Canadians think this is the answer. They don't get it. And some today still don't get it. That you want to be, you don't want to give up. You want to be First Nations people, not become part of, like, be assimilated. So, I mean, but give these people a break. This is the 19th century. This is the conventional wisdom of the time. And we have to appreciate that when we're doing our assessments. They, in a way, didn't know anything else. It's inconceivable. If John A. MacDonald gave the life today, he used to be flabbergasted. And I'm not sure, I think he might, in fact, be positive towards the changes today. He's a very amazing individual, but of course that's total speculation. Here we go. So that's the British Isles, and look at that, British Isles, and this is Canada. And he created, well, MacDonald was so instrumental in creating this country, and wow, stitching it together was a challenge. He had a very interesting relationship with Dr. Peter Edmund Jones. There's about 10 letters between them, so there's something to talk about. And he tried to help New Credit. This is astounding. It's in Alan's book. Well, first of all, the franchise. He gave the vote, and Dr. Peter Jones is very grateful for that. But he also tried to help with your finances. You had some claims, and MacDonald approved them, but unfortunately the finance department didn't. So MacDonald fought for you, but the finance department won. So, alas. But again, though, when we're making a checklist, there's some positives there. And he was certainly for New Credit. Oh yes, I talked about residential school. This is the Mohawk Institute in the 1880s. And we know, no contest, by and large, total mess. With some exceptions. For some individual, very small number, it opened a door. And Dr. Peter Jones is, like, as I said, he's mild on this. Mongwedus's son, George Henry, not so much. He would be totally opposed. These are graduates. And there it is, the gem, 1882. Wonderful. When I first came here, around early 1970s, the portraits were in the old council room. So Canada, moving along here, 9 provinces still, provincial boundaries extended. 1885, rough stuff in the Northwest. The resistance in 1885, Macdonald got through that. Much of New Credit's foundations were responsible to Peter Jones, his gift, and continued by Peter's son, Peter Edmund Jones. His opponent was George Henry, and George Henry was the son of Mangwadas. I don't have an image of George Henry, but that's Dad, Mangwadas, painted by Paul Kane. What happened with Peter Jones and Mangwadas was he was very intelligent. And Peter Jones and the others, Joseph Sawyer, they wanted him to become a chief at the Credit. But he said no, he was against this boot camp stuff, Methodist mission boot camp, restricting freedoms and all. So he organized, in effect, a Wild West show and went to Britain and Europe and did quite well at it. But Peter Jones said, don't, because you don't know the disease factor over there. It's worse than here. And half of the troop died. 7 out of 14. So make your evaluation. Who was right? Was it Peter Jones or was it Mangwadas? And, well, it's court's out, jury's out. There's no resolution. There's always 2 sides. I hope there is. Always 3 or 4. And when you're talking about the past, it's like the present. There's always different opinions. Depends who you are, where you're coming from, what age you are, what social class you're from, where you're standing. There's lots of opinions. So I'm not resolving anything. I'm just trying to put the material out on the table. And the end result, though, was, of all of this, Dr. Peter Jones, his dad, and the people themselves. Ultimately, it was you, your ancestors. The ultimate is, you made it. You adjusted. A lot of groups didn't. You became successful farmers. And you won agricultural contests in the neighborhood. That's a picture I got very early in the game. Brian LaForme and I went around, and I think it was Mrs. Herkimer had that shot. Or thank you, Brian. Thank you, because you made it possible. You got these wonderful visuals. So then we come to the other picture, and this is in Clarkson. This is berry picking, about 1900. And this shot is an absolute delight as well. Not everyone bought into this, and I hope, again, no one ever everybody buys into one thing. That's terrible. Monochromatic. No, some folks wanted to keep to the gathering and a more traditional lifestyle. And they're picking berries in Clarkson. So they were not the settled farmers, the Sawyers, and others like that, the Herkimers. They were living more the old way. And Lloyd King, he identified that tall fellow with the basket. He knew him. I didn't know him, but he knew who it was. So that's a New Credit shot. And here, almost at the end, here's a great picture of Peter Jones, his wife, and an elder. I don't know who that is, but anyways, I tell you, I can assure you, it's not George Henry. That's his nemesis. But there they are, and that's a great shot. And so Peter Jones, Dr. Peter Edmund Jones, he's the one in my books, my spin, to tell the story of New Credit in the late 19th century, right up to the war. The war is a real turning point. Dr. Jones has passed away. You have the war memorial. Well done. About 10 years old now, I think. Stacy's poem, I believe, is on. It's great, wonderful. You're remembering. War of 1812 people as well. World War I, World War II, Korean War. Great acknowledgement. So that's it. And now let's move into the third section. This is my proposal. Lloyd King. He's the one. You can tell the story of New Credit in the 20th century through Lloyd King. What a guy. There he is, picture. And Max and Malcolm are sons of Lloyd. You've got terrific resources. And Lloyd left a lot of writings. Margaret helped Lloyd put together the booklets and lots of the material is already done. So there you go. Alberta's spin on the history of New Credit. I'm really an Albertan now. I've been there 43 years, so I'm speaking from a distance, which has advantages and disadvantages. Pray for me as I pass through Six Nations. Thank you.
Miigwech Donald, that was a very informative discussion, and we'll be praying for you.